Hi everyone, Sebastian Reynolds here. Thanks for tuning into my podcast. This is number 5, and for this one I was speaking to Matthew Duffield of Sea Blue Audio, great electronic music record label, who released my friend Simon McCorry, who I actually spoke to for the first podcast of this series. And Matthew and I sort of set it up to have a conversation about my 2 EPs. So my new EP is Nihilism is Pointless, that came out on the 29th of January on the Faith and Industry label, and that followed the Universe Remembers EP, which came out in May 2020, May last year. So, and I very much see them as a pair. They work together sort of musically and thematically, and they're linked. There's pairs of tracks across them that came out of the same sort of time frames and so on. So I've worked with Faith and Industry to put together a vinyl release which puts the 2 EPs together, so 1 EP is on each side. And we're still taking pre-orders. We had some delays and so on, and hoping to bring that out in a couple of months, and we're still open to pre-orders. So if you go to my Bandcamp, sebastianreynolds.bandcamp.com, if you haven't already, then please check it out there. And if you hadn't heard me before, my website is sebastianreynolds.co.uk. My music's available widely, and it was really nice to talk to Matthew and get an opportunity to just talk over my process and what inspired these EPs and my music generally. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I'll be back again soon. Cheers. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the Sebastian Reynolds Podcast.
It's great to be here, Sebastian. Thanks for having me on.
And maybe we'll just let the listeners know a little bit about our background and how we met. So you run the label Sea Blue Audio.
Yeah, that's right.
And you released Simon McCorry, who was actually the guest for the first ever podcast.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Yeah. Simon did a 4-track EP. The Nature in Nature EP, which was released at the start of January this year. So we all sort of worked together on that project, and it got a very good response. And Simon put together 4 very good tracks, and then we met through that and started talking, basically.
Yeah. And like I said in the introduction, I've just released myself my new EP, Nihilism is Pointless, on Capital K's Faith and Industry label, and that followed the EP that I released in May 2020, The Universe Remembers. And I kind of see them and sort of conceive of them as a pair. I see them as sort of 2 sides of a coin, and I sort of had it in mind for a little while now that I wanted to give myself an opportunity to sort of talk about the music of the EPs and how they came together, the inspirations and so on. So, and you very kindly offered to sort of interview me for my podcast, which is slightly narcissistic, I will admit that.
Yeah, of course, and yes, and we've all got to do what we've got to do, So I think that's fine.
Yeah, and and it seems like there's enough people sort of listening and taking an interest in what I'm doing that maybe a few of them would like to hear a little bit more of sort of background on where the tracks have come from.
Yeah, I think that's good. And when we spoke the other day, just a little chat, we talked about how these 2 EPs, like you said, they're 2 sides of the same coin, but they also date back to your first ventures into music, when you were a teenager playing keyboards in various bands, I think around the Oxford area.
Yeah, that's correct. So I was born and brought up in Oxford and just outside. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And tell us a bit about the bands, because this was obviously in the pre-digital, modern recording techniques.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose, yeah. I mean, to go all the way back, maybe we could go all the way back to when I was very young. Like my first sort of inclinations towards music were apparently when I was 4 years old. I told my mum that I wanted to play the saxophone because of the music from the Pink Panther. That was my first sort of inkling. And obviously at 4 years old, you can't hold a saxophone. And my mum looked into it, and it turned out that the recorder is essentially the basic same fingering as a saxophone. So I sort of religiously stuck with this recorder practice, doing it every lunch. Well, my memory is every lunchtime. It kind of been every lunchtime, but regularly sort of missing lunch breaks, running around in the sun to like sit in a darkened room and try and play the recorder with a few others. And I must have stuck with it enough that when I turned, I think it was my 12th birthday, my mum bought me a saxophone. And then my dad happened to know someone who was a saxophone teacher who I started having lessons with. And I went every week, and I played in the school orchestra and wind band. And then also, I suppose around that time, I guess, 12, 13, 14, I started to get interested in sort of indie guitar music. I think the first album that I had a few like tapes and little bits and pieces when I was a kid. And I remember my dad's record collection, like Cat Stevens and all this sort of 60s, 70s stuff that he liked, Santana and Queen. Actually, Queen was a big part of our childhood. And then when I got a bit older, it was sort of the real peak of Britpop. And I remember the first album I owned, listening to it, I got over Christmas. I think it was What's the Story, Morning Glory by Oasis. And then I really got into Suede and Pulp. But it was funny with the whole Blur and Oasis thing, because I love both bands. It seemed to me like, well, they're both really good. So obviously there was a very tribal sort of north-south kind of thing that was going on there. But I was sort of just a bit bemused. It was all marketing and whatever it was, but it was a good laugh as well, like football teams and stuff. But actually, I love both bands, but I love Suede and Pulp, I think, the most. And then Radiohead came along, and OK Computer was just mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. And I really kind of took Johnny Greenwood particularly as an icon. And during that time, I'd started to play around with keyboards as well at school. And I sort of, the narcissist in me wanted to be the front man of the band and stuff, but I really couldn't sing. I mean, even for a teenage boy, it was pretty bad. And I had a friend, Nick, who could sing a bit better and had a bit of skill with the acoustic guitar, and he was into more like acoustic type stuff. And we started just mucking, as a lot of people do. You start mucking about in school, like in the music room at school. And there was a youth worker who started a little like bands thing and got us going up and rehearsing in the between the scout hut and the football pitches. There was like a changing room area and a little like cafe area place. And we used to rehearse literally in the dressing room of the football ground at the top of the hill next to my house, next to the school. And and then that was my sort of first experiences playing music, doing stuff with Nick and these other guys. And there's 2 tracks, so 1 track on each of the EPs. So on the Universal Members there's a moniker, and then on Nihilism is Pointless it's a title track. Both of those tracks have samples from these very, very first sort of cassette recordings that I made when I was, I think, 17. I think it was in 2000. And one of them, so the Nihilism track has the guitar strum, and some of the other sounds are actually samples from the recording that was made of our first ever gig at this little like pavilion place. And then a moniker is named for me and Nick's band, and it's take samples from this song that Nick wrote that we recorded together on a cassette 4-track that we borrowed from I borrowed from the music teacher. So yeah, it's sort of like, it's interesting to be releasing this stuff 21 years later.
Okay, so a quick question, Sebastian. When you say they were samples, you mean you actually sampled the original band recordings that you committed to tape?
Yeah. They are samples from the actual original cassettes, which had survived in my parents' attic for many years, and then we sold the family home last summer, and during the run up to that, we were clearing out everything, and we cleared out the attic, and I found these boxes of sort of tapes and all sorts, and it's truly magical. I mean, even if I didn't go to the next step to like actually take samples from them and make music from them, there's just something about having that connection to that time is truly magical, because it seems like such a long time ago now.
Okay, interesting. And then I suppose one of the things about Radiohead is they blurred the boundary between rock and post-rock and then more electronic music production. So was that a way that you then began to discover electronic music?
Yeah, absolutely. It was one of the routes. I do think it's still slightly overlooked the extent to which Kid A was such a profound sort of cultural moment, really. And if you think like their progression from being a kind of, Tom York in his stripy t-shirt with his blonde hair for the Creep video, trying to be like Kurt Cobain, and then sort of maturing and starting to find their own voice and writing some incredible songs with the Bends, and then the sort of apex in a way of that progression with OK Computer, with the sort of sophistication of the instrumentation and the production and what Godrich did with them, and was phenomenal. But then they could have quit after OK Computer and we would still be talking about them. I mean, they would have left an incredible legacy. But to then come out with Kid A was just astounding and such a huge gamble and commercially, and so powerful as an artistic statement. And I think that it brought a whole generation of people such as myself who were rooted in indie guitar music through to all of those kinds of music that they'd already been listening to and interested in, and they found a way to sort of express it and incorporate it into their work. And from Aphex Twin and Autechre and the Warp stuff and all the free jazz and Stockhausen, but particularly Oliver Messiaen, as well as huge influence on Johnny Greenwood, and has now become one of my favorite composers as well. And yeah, I think that album sort of gave license to go beyond the safe. It's remarkable.
Now, you mentioned that you played some live concerts with the band as well, but I get the sense that you felt after a while the band format wasn't quite what you were looking for, and you wanted to maybe find a different format for making your own music.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like I say, I sort of grew up with these icons of late 90s, early noughties music, like especially sort of musically. So I was a keyboard player. I tried to sort of play guitar, but I couldn't do it. My hands didn't get around it. So I've always been the keyboard player, and Johnny Greenwood was a real sort of inspiration in terms of the role that one could have in the band, like not just being sort of sat behind the piano, but just sort of making weird sounds and doing electronics and sort of, that kind of place. Now, I've always had strong ideas, and I've always been very creatively involved in all the bands that I've been in, and some more than others, but in terms of driving the direction of things. But it's, more recently, we've had people like Nils Frahm and these sorts of guys who, they're not singers, they're not songwriters, they're instrumentalists, but they found a way to perform live as a solo artist, even if they have guests involved, that's sort of credible in its own form. Whereas I didn't really have that. I didn't really grow up with these people to say, well, even if you're not the singer, because like so much live music is either dance music, like guys with laptops and people sort of raving away, or it's sort of song based. So if you can't sing and you don't want to make club music, where does that leave you, in terms of like role models? So I sort of pursued the band thing, and I think it was partly just a lack of confidence and a lack of inspiration in terms of, well, and also technically because it never even occurred to me that I could sort of put myself out as a solo artist. And I was always, because I didn't have my own computer set up until quite a bit later in my 20s, I was always kind of beholden to working on music with other people who did have a home computer studio setup. And even once I had my own, it took me quite a while of work to get confident enough to start feeling like, actually, I can do this. I can do something myself. But yeah, so I was having ideas though, like, and like I say, some of the music I'm releasing now, it's from ideas and concepts that I've been developing this whole time, this whole sort of 2021 year process. Like, for example, Howl's Lament, the track on Nihilism is Pointless. I remember having the idea for that track in a youth hostel in New Zealand on a holiday when I was 19. So that's 19 years ago since I actually had the original idea. And since then, I sort of tried working on different versions with a couple of different friends. And the version I've released on the EP is sort of a synergy of these different versions that I was developing over time. So it's just been a very sort of long, slow process coming to where I am now, basically.
It seems as though there's a lot of different influences, because you mentioned the original band and the lo-fi type recordings, and then there's hip hop samples in a couple of the tracks. There's some quite dub heavy beats, with a strong dub quality. Then you could hear the influence of the more modern classical style. You've got somebody playing the clarinet, I believe, in a couple of tracks. So how do you fit all these things together?
Takes a long time. It's been, like I say, these EPs, and there's also the music I've released previously, like with the trio I'm in with Anna Muller and Alex Stolzer, the solo collective. Anna's a cellist, Alex is a violinist, and we sort of collaborated as a trio and released a couple of collaborative records. And then there's also these two EPs, Mahajanika and Mani Mekala, that came out of the Thai dance and music project as well. And I think I've just, like I say, I've always had a tremendously active imagination. Like since I was at primary school, I've just what teachers would always say about me, for coming up with stories and just coming up with ideas and so on. And like you were saying about when we talked before as well, this thing about technology and how technology informs creativity. And I think of course, there's a cyclical relationship between you and your medium. You'll make different choices, whether you're using Ableton or Logic or Pro Tools or Reaper or whatever it might be. And obviously, if whatever 4-track cassette recorder you're using, you'll be making slightly different choices. There's always effects, and I use normal keyboards. I've got Casios and a Yamaha DX and so on. And I've also got synth apps on my phone. And of course, if I'm playing a synth on my iPhone, then I'll play different notes to if I'm playing on my Casio or whatever it might be. Like there's always an interdependent relationship between you as an individual and then the technology that you're using. But I think the real roots of your creativity are sort of innate in a way. I think they're more sort of it's a sort of fundamental urge to express. And, I talked with Simon in great detail about this thing about how the explosion of technology has affected the creation of art and music in the 20th century and beyond, and will continue to do so.
Do you think this is generally a positive thing? I mean, I think you mentioned earlier that when we spoke before, that really technology has given people very little in terms of barriers to expression and imagination. But do you think there might be a downside to this as well?
I think it's sort of, I think the thing that I've sort of highlighted as a downside, I mean, artists are insecure. People are insecure. That's just a fundament of that sort of nature of personality who sort of gravitates towards artistic expression and creativity. It's just the nature of the beast. The trouble artist, like that is a thing. That's a reality. That's not imagined.
A real phenomenon, no?
Yeah, absolutely. But so, and I would say one sort of negative expression of that in terms of the modern landscape and modern, say, in the last 20 to 30 years, it's been sort of heightened, is the sort of access to equipment and the sort of innovation for innovation's sake kind of tendencies and this sort of obsession with newness in terms of how this technology is being used. We're sort of chasing our tail in a way, because Ableton and these sorts of tools are becoming just so powerful and so multifaceted that it's hard to kind of keep up. Like, most people that use Ableton probably don't even scratch the surface, myself included, don't even scratch the surface of the actual technical possibilities. Like, there's a very particular kind of artist who is almost as much a software engineer who will get into Max MSP and really get into the tech, like really getting into the technical side. And of course, because the software is so flexible and so powerful, it's the positive side is that it gives that room for personal creativity and using and everything will have more and more subtlety and nuance, which sort of defines you and your palette and your decision-making processes. But then on the other hand, I think it can culturally make people a little bit neurotic and a little bit obsessed with originality for originality's sake. Now, I just put a disclaimer in there, because pre all of this, let's say pre-20th century, when there was classical, like maybe more detail, but to oversimplify slightly to make the point, there was classical music, conservatoire trained composers working often under patronage, composing and having to meet the expectations. And then people learn, like, gradually starting to push the envelope in different ways. And of course, things like the invention of the piano was a bit of a game changer and so on. But generally, the shifts move very slowly. And then there's folk music, the folk music world, which was as much about storytelling and passing on the legacy and the lineage of the tradition of these songs that were hundreds and hundreds of years old, if not older. But still, every single folk singer would have their own way of doing things, right? They'd have their own way of singing the songs. They'd adapt things and interpret things. And, so in that sense, there was still always innovation. It's just there wasn't, like, people still just had the voice and whatever instruments were to hand, but they would always, like, it's what defines our species, is the facility for problem solving through creativity. And the problem of culture and art, what that is the attempt to express oneself. So whether it's just you're singing a song that's 1,000 years old, or whether I'm sat here making a tune that's brand new, that's come out of thin air, there's still that same want of, like, expression and self-expression. And I think that it's easy to get slightly, because this is something me and Simon talked about a bit that we touched on, but I'd like to sort of repeat in a way and expand on, is this thing of, like, this odd kind of dichotomy where on the one hand we have this huge explosion, this sort of, what's it called, Cambrian explosion of genres and styles, which are facilitated by all of this technology and how those different technologies combine together. But there's still the same essential truths. I mean, there's only so many things to write music about, and are human beings really any different than we were 1,000 years ago? And if you look at cinema, it's all just sort of, you can see the continuity with storytelling traditions of the last 5,000 years. It's just they're presented in a slightly different way, but the actual substructure is continuous in terms of what.
Yes, I mean family conflicts and societal conflicts and political conflicts existed now, and they did in medieval, and they did in Greek, and they did in probably going back to Stone Age society. So these are common threads. I think this is true.
So it's we're just finding newer and newer ways to express these same eternal truths.
That's an interesting idea, yeah. Now, carrying on from this, obviously we've talked a lot about the technical side of making the music, but there's also the other side, which is the ideas and the emotions and the opinions and attitudes you want to express. And there's certainly a dystopian edge, not just in your choices of cultural references, Hal and T.S. Eliot and things like this, which are landmark moments of dystopia, shall we say, from the 20th century. But in general, there is an air of dystopian undertone. I think I'll call it that way, to all the tracks on the EP. It doesn't mean to say they're necessarily nihilistic. I mean, the EP is called Nihilism is Pointless. And they're certainly not fatalistic, but they're certainly a venture into the darker side, shall we say.
Yeah, no, absolutely so. And it was quite interesting, actually, because it's worth saying that in terms of how I compose and produce and put these EPs together, there was very much a process of, because I have been, making music in the background alongside all the various bands I've been in over the years, I've amassed this vast sort of catalogue of tracks and ideas and so on. Like I say, the Howl track, I originated when I was still a teenager. And so I sort of, for the first of the two EPs, for Universe Remembers, I certainly had some material, and then I worked on some more, and I kind of coalesced out of tracks that I made on the spot and then stuff that I already had from before. And so a lot of my work is kind of, in a way, curating my music as much as actually just making stuff. It's not like I think of a theme and then I sit down and make 5 tracks on that subject. It's more that I'll start to have some ideas and I'll think, oh, maybe that'll work with that. So a lot of my time, I'm just listening to my own stuff, and putting stuff together in iTunes, making playlists and thinking, well, does that work? Does that work? Or maybe I'll make one more track. Although the counter to that is that I've got an EP which I finished, but it probably won't come out till summer 21, called Infancy, which is more of like a theme, and I made stuff more with a theme in mind. So that's slightly atypical for me. But for these two, I sort of compiled the tracks. I made 1 or 2 things new to go with it and put it together. And it was only after the fact that I realised that certainly with Nihilism is Pointless, there's this sort of conundrum of the human condition, is the fact that, there's suffering is inevitable and death is inevitable. How do you maintain a sort of level head in the face of that, and this idea of, and the sort of, because on the one hand the title is sort of facetious and a bit silly, but then on the other hand, I am a bit of an earnest person essentially, and I am a hopeful, optimistic person, and I feel like even if you are going to die someday, you might as well try and enjoy your life and make the most of it. But there's a lot in the tracks that is about sort of preparing for death as well, and not sort of. It's almost like it's a relief, because I think we live perpetually in kind of fear of death and not knowing what's going to happen. But there's actually confronting it is actually hugely liberating. You know, it's about the freedom of that, the freeing effect of contemplating mortality, as opposed to going down an obvious path of sort of nihilism and self-destruction.
Okay, is this philosophy or is opinion based on any religious or spiritual practice or ideas that you've absorbed?
Yeah, I've studied Buddhism for a long time. I've been practicing Buddhist meditation for around 15 years, something like that, since I was in my early 20s. And that's that kind of idea of, rather than running away from mortality and the suffering of the world, either, because there's two ways of running away. You can either turn a blind eye and try and pretend it's not there, or you can kind of sink into hopelessness and despair. And it's like, neither is helpful, and neither is what the Buddha intended. I think he intended courage, basically, courageously confronting the worst realities, and just how liberating that is. What relief that feels like if you truly come to terms with. And, you know, you meet people, like, especially people that work in death, like people that work in hospices and work in hospitals and so on, who they're surrounded by death and suffering, but they're completely at peace. I mean, they're courageous. They've really confronted their own demons, but, you know, they have a sort of peace and hope that's not mawkish or unrealistic. It's completely rooted in the reality of suffering, but it's not overwhelmed by it either. And I've had a few experiences, like my mother passed away a few years ago from cancer, and we had that experience of going through it, and so that was profoundly inspiring, these sorts of things. So I think and the idea of the title "The Universe Remembers" is about that what good you do will not be forgotten. Like, it doesn't have to have been acknowledged by another person, but I do believe that there will be consequences of good action, whether you can see those or not.
So it's like the idea that if you put good out into the world in some way, that good will exist independently of you.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
It's interesting. Now, the other thing I noticed about the tracks is that if you hadn't heard them at this point in the conversation, you might think the tracks would be quite long. Yeah, because there is a tendency in electronic music now to make quite long tracks, 7, 8, 9, even 10 minutes. Your tracks are actually quite short, around the 3-4 minute mark. So they have this feeling of kind of little short stories or something like this. Is this something you deliberately tried to do?
I've actually deliberately tried to do the opposite and failed. I was joking with Adrienne that because in the last year or so, I've been listening to quite a lot of really long, really slow ambient music. Yeah, there's I think he's Canadian or awkward Canadian or American, guy called Lossil, who's phenomenal, beautiful, beautiful ambient music, and a lot of really long, slow tracks. And, you know, I love Steve Reich and all his long sort of processed music and so on. And there's a point in the last year or so where I actually have sat down and tried to make music like that, and it just doesn't come out. I can't explain it. It's certainly not deliberate. It's certainly not like everything has to be 3 minutes or I'll get bored, you know, because, you know, I practice meditation. I do long running, you know, I'm happy to sit and watch a film. You know, it's not like I have a short attention span. You know, I love long form music and long form art, but for reasons which I can't express, it's coming out like this at the moment.
That's interesting because I did notice that the tracks were quite short. When, like you say, music from the ambient electronic side of things at the moment, it tends to be quite long and often long form.
Yeah.
Has become quite a popular technique. So it's an interesting contrast, I thought.
It's by no means sort of conscious or deliberate. I don't know why it comes out like that, to be honest.
Now, going back to the influence, we mentioned Hal, and obviously you reference T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and things like this. And these were pieces of work that were very much written of their time. If we think about Hal, it was the first journey into space or the first explorations into space, which now seem like a very distant thing because we have Elon Musk talking about arranging people to go and live in Mars and space tourism. So how do you think there is a connection here between going back to those original sort of cultural reference points and where we are now?
Well, I think with Hal, it's, even though in the sense we've moved on from that time, in that we actually are starting to get out into our solar system and starting to explore other planets and even going beyond the moon and starting to think more about Mars and the possibilities there. I think for me, what I mean by the Hal track, it's more to do with something that Kubrick was pointing out, which is just becoming more and more of an issue, not less of an issue, which is the synergy and the relationship between artificial intelligence and us, and the dangers of the fact that we are flawed, as a species, and we have hate and malevolence and all these terrible facets which are built into every human being. They're there in almost every human being. There's precious few human beings who are truly enlightened, and they're certainly not the ones running the companies that are making AI technology, whether it's Google and the social media platforms with their algorithms or the robotics companies. They're certainly not enlightened beings. Some of them are very well intentioned for sure, but the problem is that it's inevitable that we will build the worst sociopathic tendencies of the worst human beings into our technology. Like, that's just inevitable. So we have to think about what are the consequences of that. What is going to happen and what's already happening as a result. And you look at the sort of, it's easy to get caught up in thinking about the highly sophisticated dystopian nightmares, when Skynet comes online, like the whole Terminator thing and so on, and these sort of amazing robots with guns walking around enslaving people. It's like, well, there's already a bit of an issue here with the fact that social media seems to fuel negative emotions and seem to thrive on negative emotions, and the sort of clickbait culture is predicated on fueling anger and fear and hatred and so on. It's like these algorithms are relatively simple compared to what we're going to have, and this technology is going to grow in its sophistication exponentially. So, people are really concerned, including Musk has expressed his concerns about these things growing exponentially very, very quickly. But we've already got serious problems with what we've already got that we don't know how to manage. And so the Hal track is, Kubrick nailed it with that idea, with that character. I know Arthur C. Clarke as well, between them. It's almost a bit cliche to say it, and that's the problem, because yeah, whatever, we'll be all right. It's like, well, maybe.
Maybe not. Maybe not, yeah. Okay, and if we think about Eliot, I mean, he was a man writing, as I remember my school English studies, writing in the aftermath of the First World War and in the aftermath of the devastation that was caused by the war. And while we don't have that situation now, we certainly have other phenomena, the coronavirus pandemic being one, which has brought death, and you mentioned death earlier, a little closer to all our lives. And I know these tracks were conceived before this time, but do you think there is any kind of connection or synergy there?
We live permanently on the brink of what's the term? Catastrophe. You know, we live. You know, we're overdue a sort of cataclysmic meteor strike. You know, we're overdue a volcanic event that could wipe out our species like that. You know, we're permanently on the brink of death and of global catastrophe, and so it's just an existential reality of our species. And you know, we almost died out as a species. They know that. I can't remember the details, but we got down to a few thousand. I think we got down to a population of like 5,000 or something at one point during our evolution, and we managed to claw our way back from the brink. Like, you know, we and things like Noah's Ark, you know, that's just there, you know, and in a sense, like, that's on a like group level, that's on a global level, but on a personal level, there's no guarantees that someone you love isn't going to die tomorrow. There's no guarantees that you're not going to be crippled in a car accident like next week. I mean, you know, we all live under this sort of shadow of cataclysmic terror. Like, again, and that's what I'm saying before with nihilism is pointless. How do you take that reality and face it courageously and still live a meaningful life? And it's as true, and in many ways, of course, even despite all of these different situations, we still, you know, we have sign of genuine risks and things to overcome individually and collectively, but they're still continuous with our history as a species, but they also are new as well.
So in what you're describing as a very physical, elemental battle, from climate change and pollution and health issues and food production and things like this, what role then do you think music and creative endeavour has in all this?
That's a really good question.
I mean, you said in a moment about leading a meaningful life, and I don't think there's any definition or any set way to describe what a meaningful life is. It can be many different things. But how do you think creativity, which may seem on the surface of it to be trivial compared to other problems, can still have an equal level of significance in having a good human experience?
Yeah, I absolutely think that it's. I mean, essentially, it's whatever gets you out of bed in the morning. You know, whatever makes you feel good, whatever makes you feel sort of worthwhile, and there's certainly something profoundly useful where you do acknowledge the malevolence of the world and you acknowledge your finite, vulnerable existence, and then you make of it what you can. And if you're lucky enough, like I am, to have a passion and a kind of a vocation for life, a calling in life, the ability to fulfill that will sort of get you through those dark times and help you deal with the challenges and the difficulties that you'll inevitably face, and that meaning and purpose will sort of shield you from becoming resentful and embittered, which is kind of and inevitable consequences of not feeling like there's any reason to be existing, and that it's unfair that other people are better off than you in whatever way it might be.
Okay, interesting. And just following on from that, one of the things also that I think when we've talked before, and you've mentioned a couple of times already, is the fact that a lot of your work features collaborators. You're not, from what I understand, somebody who's stuck in their studio in their attic and then comes out with a track. There's other people's inputs and other people's musicianship as well. Like, for example, we had the clarinet player, and I believe there's other musicians on involved in these EPs. So tell us a bit about your collaborations and how they work.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've got to mention Rachel Coombs. So she's the clarinet player I've been working with, and it's funny because for a long time I've been very keen on having a clarinet and working with a clarinet player for. Yeah, I just really love the sound of it, and it's slightly underused and overlooked, and it's just a beautiful instrument. And I met Rachel a few years ago, and we did some kind of playing together, and then she happened to come back to Oxford at exactly the right moment. So it's kind of synchronicity, as Jung would call it. And she played on Mother's Day and Nihilism is Pointless, and on the Universe Remembers track as well. And it's been interesting because I don't know if it's a coincidence. I don't think so, that the tracks with clarinet have been doing particularly well. Actually, they've been particularly popular. And Elizabeth Alker from Radio 3 played Mother's Day the other night, and she made a comment, more clarinet in ambient music. And I can confirm that there will be more clarinet in ambient music coming from me and Rachel at some point.
Well, that's definitely a positive thing. And what about in terms of other musicians like guitars and more traditional rock or post-rock?
So there's James Maund, who I played with in a band called Flights of Helios. He's played on a few tracks with me. He's on Everest and Diving Board. And then also on both of those tracks as well is Andrew Warren, who I play with in the band for Julia Mayer, a Swedish artist who I actually manage as well. And really Mike Bannard, who runs the Aviary and Safe House Studios in Oxford, he's sort of a very, very close collaborator. He produces and mixes with me, well, certainly mixes, and helps me record stuff when I need to record acoustic instruments sometimes. So he's mixed both the EPs with me. I'm full of ideas, but I always benefit from a second pair of ears just for sort of tweaking and balancing. He's got more of a technical ear and technical mind. So I hugely benefit from Mike's input. And also Lupo in Berlin masters all my music for me. And most also very important collaborator for me is Greg Stewart, he was the drummer in a band called Guillemots, who people will have heard of, with Fife Dangerfield. And Greg is a really close friend of mine and a prolific creative genius, and he's just churning out just beats, sounds, ideas, and he sends me stuff, and I'm hugely grateful to him. Some of his samples have been the sort of spur for some of my favorite tracks of mine, like Everest, that drum break and stuff, and the synth pad sound came from him. And actually Everest has a sample of his daughter's heartbeat in the womb, which is pretty fun. And yeah, he continues to sort of send me stuff and play on stuff, and he's just a genius, and I love him to bits. He's amazing. And there's others as well. There's a guy called Ben Thomas, who is a friend of mine. He did a little bit of production beat stuff, the jungly sort of section in Diving Board. He did that for me, and he's doing a remix of one of my new tracks. And he has a project called L'Étranger, sort of French housey type stuff. I can't think of anyone else, but I'm sure there'll be at least 3 people listening to this being like, you didn't say me, sorry.
Where am I in all this? So, I mean, a logical extension or a logical next question would be, when we can, post-COVID, and if the live scene ever...
It will
yeah.
be all right.
Of course.
I'm an optimist.
Yeah. Give it 6 months. Do you think you could do anything in some kind of live capacity, given the collaborators or given the way you make music?
Yeah, we already have done a couple of performances. We did a gig supporting my friend Neil's band Merceau in London, and it was me, Rachel, James, and Mike on stage. And it was sort of, I was playing piano and I had my laptop with the Ableton Push, and Rachel was playing clarinet, James was playing guitar, Mike was doing some effects stuff on the clarinet. So, and we rehearsed a set for the EP launch for The Universe Remembers. We were going to play some gigs May, June 2020, but of course the virus put a pay to that. So we did actually have a set worked out based on these tunes and some of my other tunes. So we've got a set basically sorted out. I just thought of another collaborator I should mention. There's a track on The Universe Remembers called You Are Forgotten. And that was a bit of a like tongue-in-cheek thing because obviously the EP is called The Universe Remembers and then the last track is called You Are Forgotten. So it's a bit of a play. But that was actually based on, that's a remix sort of a track by my friends Tom McDonnell and Oliver Shaw in Oxford, and they had a project together called Desmond Chancer. And like I sort of took Tom's vocal and a little bit of the piano from that track, and it sort of starts off a little, there's some other samples of an old organ and stuff. It's sort of got this kind of Moby vibe with the vocal. Tom's got a very sort of soul-y voice with all these weird drony samples, but then it sort of explodes at the end. And that was produced with, not with Mike actually, that was produced with Ollie Horton, who's known as Dream Track, and Adam Davey played saxophone on it. So there's, some of my tracks, it's like a team of people involved. And then others are just by me. I mean, some of them are genuinely solo efforts, but some of them are very much like a collaborative process.
I think one thing we haven't yet touched upon in terms of the influences is there's certainly a dubstep, post-dubstep, that style of electronica coming through, whether obviously it's like Burial, but also I think that in general the music has a very modern quality as well, because it is referencing things that are also very current. Is that part of your musical influence still?
Yeah, trip hop till I die, baby.
Fair enough. Yeah.
It was part of the part of that kind of process of exploring, and finding new kinds of music when I was a teenager. It was very much, I was inspired and interested by Massive Attack and Portishead and all this, bit later Burial as well, and those sort of glitchy, crackly, ethereal, very minimal kind of dream worlds. And there's certainly that is something I was into. And it's funny as well, because when I was a teenager, I briefly went out with a goth girl and I got a little bit gothic for a while, and I used to listen to Marilyn Manson. And actually, like, some of his stuff, like, there's obviously some of it is just really like out and out hate music, like really loud, aggressive, thrashy. But a lot of it, he's taken on the whole Bowie thing, and there's some of the production and some of the sort of ways that some of the stuff is put together is completely bananas, a really strange and odd kind of use of electronics and atmospheres. And I think that made quite an interesting impression on me. Some of that stuff like Antichrist Superstar and Mechanical Animals, and those records were like, for a teenager, like pretty out there actually. Like, I know some of it is a bit naff and a bit hammy and whatever, like kind of gothy horror sort of thing.
A bit cabaret, no?
Exactly, a bit camp, and that's fine as well. But like, actually some of it was like the stuff that's most deranged wasn't the like thrashy heavy stuff. It was some of the other stuff that was a bit less bombastic.
Okay. Now, just thinking back to your early days, and you began these tracks when you were a teenager, or the ideas and even some of the samples and original sounds. So if you could go back to your 18-year-old self and project into the future to your current self and listen to the music that you've created and is released under these two EPs, what do you think your feelings would be?
I don't think I'd be hugely surprised because, like I say, a lot of these things were... I mean, in a way, this is at least some of it is the sort of music that if I'd had the ability and the tools, I would have made at the time. Or like I did make stuff that was sort of similar, but it wasn't so good. Or, you know, it was just like a band stuff that we played live that was never recorded. So I think there probably, I suspect that there is there are your like baseline aesthetics and things that you love that to an extent at least become fixed around that age. I mean, literally, because your brain's developing, isn't it, up until your early 20s. And there's been arguments, I think there is neuroplasticity, like people can fundamentally evolve and change as well. But I think there's certainly at least an element of things becoming sort of fixed in a way. And, you know, some of these, like the 18-year-old self or the 20-year-old self would know the samples, like the sample in the Nihilism track or the sample in the Wasteland. Like I was playing around with those back then. You know, I loved the clarinet then. So I think there's definitely some new stuff has happened, but I feel like, and also during that time, you know, like I said, I got into Messiaen and I was involved in the London Sinfonietta and had these incredible experiences of concerts with Luigi Nono, Messiaen, Reich, all these people. You know, I had such a rich mixture of experiences at a young age. I'm playing in the keyboard choir, which is a live electronic ensemble, Brain Dead Collective or Holiday in Vietnam. I had these sort of improv-y bands. You know, I was doing a lot of stuff back then. You know, lots of different projects, late teens, early 20s. So, you know, it was more a means. It's more lacking the technical ability and the tools rather than so much the sort of where I naturally find myself if I'm music making.
Okay, so extending that further into the future, let's say we project another 10 years with technology advancing at, let's say, an equivalent or faster pace to how it's developed over the last 20 years. Well, how do you think you'll be making, or will you be making music, or what form will it take in the future? What do you think the next thing is going to be?
That's a really good question. I never think about that. I'm so kind of caught up in the present moment because, you know, at the moment I've just released a second EP. I'm still kind of excited about sharing the two EPs together now for people to listen to. So that's sort of become its own thing. I'm just finishing off the album, my first album, which is going to be a continuity from these two EPs. It's all new material. It's not material that's on these EPs at all, but it's sort of connected but different. And I've got another EP, like I said, the Infancy EP, where the music's finished, but I'm going to be collaborating with some interesting partners for its release for next summer. I've got a film... there's a film score I can't say too much about at the moment in the pipeline, and I've got a dance commission with Neon Dance for their new dance work, Prehension. Like, I'm so caught up in now that I don't really... I live in the moment. I'm a Buddhist, aren't I? I live in the moment.
Yeah, maybe that's the best way to be, yeah.
And we might just get hit by a meteor next week anyway.
What does it matter? Yeah. Now, one of the things that you and Simon have in common is on Simon McCoy's EP, Nature in Nature, was originally commissioned for a piece of contemporary dance from an artist in Japan. And as I understand it, contemporary dance and scoring music for contemporary dance is also part of your palette. But contemporary dance is very far removed from technology. It's a very physical world. So how do those two things connect?
I think it's, for me, because I've worked on a couple of projects with Neon Dance Company and actually had the fortune to be in the studio with the dancers, sort of co-creating all at the same time. So there's lots of different ways sometimes that dance companies can work. Sometimes they'll have the score basically delivered by the composer who never even comes into the studio, or they'll be working with a choreographer, but the score will just be sort of made and then the dancers will work with the pre-existing, pre-written material. But how we've worked is that I'll be in the studio with the dancers and sometimes I'll have made something in advance that we'll then improvise, or we'll just make stuff up on the spot. And it really creates this wonderful ability to have that dialogue between movement and sound. So I've got my Ableton Push, which is a controller, a bit like an MPC style controller so you can have all the sounds there and you can be watching the dancers and improvising. And I've done bits and pieces of music for film and for scoring and stuff, and I've done a lot of improvising. So I'm used to the improvised mindset, and it's just another layer where rather than just playing keyboard and working with other musicians and responding to each other, there's this other thing that's happening, but it's very closely connected. So it's a very sort of natural thing for me.
Okay, good. So when you're not making music, what do you like to do, Sebastian?
Sebastian, Seb, both. My mum would call me Seb or Sebastian. Sebastian if I was bad. I was only Sebastian if I was in trouble.
Oh, often I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. What do I like to do? Well, like I've mentioned, I'm very interested in Buddhism and meditation. And I also run at an amateur level, club level. So I was a member of Oxford City Athletics for many, many years. I've recently moved to Swindon and I'm joining Swindon Harriers. I particularly enjoy track running, 800 and 1500. I've done lots of park runs. I'm a real park run junkie. So 5K is okay. I'm not so into longer stuff. I'll race up to 10K, or like a lot of the cross countries are 4 or 5 miles, but I'm not. I run 16 miles on a Sunday, so that's 2 hours. That's my long run. But I run about 40-mile weeks, and a lot of it is sort of speed sessions. So I don't just do super long endurance stuff, but maybe I'll look at doing a half or more 10Ks as I get fitter. And basically watch a lot of X-Files.
Well, they suddenly seem dated, and suddenly they don't seem so dated now. No.
Yeah, they're free with Amazon Prime, so it's funny because I had the thought that I definitely watched some of it, and some of it has been familiar, but a lot of it hasn't even been familiar. So I don't think I saw all of it when I was younger. I've got I'm always dabbling and experimenting in different kinds of sort of wellness and lifestyle type things. Like my latest thing is fasting. I read Dave Asprey's book, Asprey, his book on it's something I've already been experimenting with for a couple of years on and off. But I've just there's something about having a hobby like sort of running and fitness where it's not just sort of doing something you dislike because you feel like you should for your health. It's actually you do it enough so that you start to feel like you have a little bit of a talent for it, and there's this feeling of trying to work out how your body works and how to improve it, how to sort of hack it is the term now. And I've been on this journey for the last 7 or 8 years really, where I've just been really trying to work out how to get myself into the best possible physical and mental shape. And I've experimented so much. I've had real issues with my stomach and all that inflammation, and I've tried so many different things, and I feel like I'm finally started to sort of work out how to make that work. And fasting is amazing, both physically but also mentally and spiritually. And I feel like I have a slight regret because I've been doing meditation for a long time, but I've only recently really come to understand the sort of power and benefit of fasting, and how it's probably as much of an integral part of a spiritual process as meditation. And also I've been I looked up on like Wim Hof and doing some of the cold stuff. I have cold baths and cold showers and stuff like that as well. So I make my physical well-being a hobby in itself, in a way, just experimenting on myself.
So Seb, the last thing I was going to ask you about is your connection with the label. And both these EPs have come out on the Faith and Industry label and with vinyl editions. That's correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Working with Faith and Industry. So I met Christian through the Brainlove Records label, I guess probably about 10, 15 years ago. So in my 20s, it's all a bit blurry, but some point in my 20s, I met Christian through John Brainlove at it's a festival called Wallfire Festival, I believe. I think it's probably not still going. And I was playing with keyboard choir, and yeah, we met at this festival. John Brainlove was curating some bands with me for one of the stages, and we hung out and it was fun. And then Christian is known under his artist name Capital K. So he's released a series of records over the last however long, since the 90s. And he's a great guy. And he was at the time running a studio called Platt Ziot in Hampton. Basically, I think it was sort of near Hampton Court, basically on the river there. And he did a gig and that me and John organised at the George Tavern in Stepney, and I did an improvisation thing called Brain Dead Collective, and he sort of invited us to come down, and we went down for a weekend, and Greg was there, Greg was drumming and stuff, and we just improvised and hung out and jammed and all this stuff, and it was really fun, and made an album that was never released. It was called Lost and Profound. We lost it, unfortunately. No, we didn't. We've still got it.
Somewhere.
It will come out. Yeah, somewhere it's out there. And through that, I can't quite remember how it came about, but we ended up collaborating with Viv Albertine of the Slits. I met her through a guy called Toby and something to do with Residence FM. I think we did an improvisation thing as Brain Dead Collective, and it was this sort of Friday lunchtime thing at the Foundry, the bar that was in the old bank vaults at Old Street. And we met her there, and then somehow got to know her a bit, and then we did somehow it came about that we recorded these 2 Christmas songs with her, with Christian. It's quite funny because Christian's pretty cool and whatever, but he admitted to me that he was actually a little bit starstruck meeting Viv Albertine, which was quite funny. So yeah, me and Christian sort of developed this friendship, really, hanging out in London and sort of just doing stuff. And he started the label quite a while ago now. He was primarily releasing his own stuff. And then in the last few years, he's gave up his involvement in Platt Ziot, or it shut down or whatever. And he moved in, and now he's the main engineer, and he runs the studio at Total Refreshment Centre in Hackney, and he records lots of bands there. I've done a few different recording things with him. He's recorded little bits and pieces for my solo stuff, and yeah, we just stayed friends and hung out and done music together. Like, he recorded the most recent Julia Mayer EP, which is actually coming out this Friday, the 25th of February. Mayer, Meijer, Swedish artist, really fab, and Greg drums for her as well. I got Greg in the band, but yeah. So Christian's got great taste, of course, releasing me, but also others as well. I wish I could. Oh, there, John Johanna is on the label, which is fantastic. He released Super Best Friends Club, which is friends of mine, and there's a sort of improv-y thing called Champagne Dub, which is very cool. I should have researched and checked out a few more of the names of the acts, but yeah, it's a fantastic label, and it's a real honour to be part of it. And actually, with the vinyl thing, so the EPs, The Universe Remembers and Nihilism is Pointless, they fit perfectly. Each one fits perfectly on a side of vinyl, and as they are sort of thematically, musically, conceptually two sides of the same coin, it just lent itself to creating this product of it being that. So it's both EPs, one on each side, and we're still, because of the virus nonsense and everything else, we've had delays galore. So we launched pre-orders in December, but we've had all sorts of setbacks and difficulties. But we're still taking pre-orders for the EPs for the vinyl release. So if anyone's listening to this and wants to check it out or get involved, then please do sebastianreynolds.bandcamp.com or Faith and Industry. Look up Faith and Industry on Bandcamp, and you can put a pre-order down for the vinyl. I need to check with Christian. We hoping to get that out in the spring.
Cool.
In a couple of months. So, but it helps a lot if there are pre-orders. So please get in touch.
Okay, cool. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add? I think we've covered a lot of interesting ground. No,
I mean, if you've bothered to listen all the way through, then I applaud you. Thank you very much. And sebastianreynolds.co.uk. And just to say again that I really respect and appreciate your work with C Blue Audio, and it's a wonderful label that I'm really enjoying discovering. And obviously, like we've said, Simon McCorry is our sort of mutual friend and contact, and his music is magnificent. And the latest EP, Nature in Nature, is out now. Yeah, it's a really fine piece of work, actually. A really fine piece of work. Yeah, for sure. And I like I've said before, I definitely want to have you back on the podcast, and I'll interview you. Okay, perfect. We can return the favour, as it were. Yeah, we can talk about the label and your sort of history in the music industry and so on. But that's probably enough for today. I think so. Okay, great. Sebastian. I don't really mind. It's just that's like, it's a funny thing with the whole name thing, because it's, up until this point, I've never cared at all what people call me. People can call me, and like at a personal level, I don't care at all. It's just that, like, if people out there are seeing me like on my website all over, whenever I'm on the radio, it's always Sebastian. It is actually a slightly, but then also no self, no ego. Like, who cares? We're all gonna die. We're all gonna die anyway. We're all gonna die anyway. So it's all good. It's all good. Okay, that was great. Yeah, thanks very much, Matthew. I'll talk to you later. Okay, speak soon, yeah? See you later. Cheers, bye.